Hello, guys and dolls. Thank you for joining us today. It's Amber, me again, with Scott Santens, and he's a writer and advocate for basic income. And I'm very excited because this is a topic I've always been interested in. And I'm just really honored to have you here, Scott. And I'm just going to let you take it away and tell us your personal bio, what got you into basic income, educational background, who you write for, and all that jazz.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on here today. And yeah, I got started with the idea of a basic income, and the idea is that people would receive on an individual basis, without conditions, universally to everyone, an amount of money to that's sufficient to meet their most basic needs, with no work requirements. You keep it in addition to all other work. It's really about creating a secure foundation or floor underneath
Mm.
everybody. And I got into this idea uh, through through a conversation thread on Reddit that back in 2013. And this conversation that Reddit was having on the front page was just about how quickly technology is advancing, and how really people have no idea how fast it's advancing and what really that means for a future. And it was just really interesting because here I thought that I was following up, keeping tabs on technology, and I felt I was fairly well informed. But there was still a lot of stuff, I had no idea that was happening. Like one of the examples that really got me was that there were already these giant self-driving trucks operating in mines already,
Mhm.
at the Rio Tinto, and the the their goal was actually to fully automate their truck fleet by 2020. And so I think at the time they're already like 20% of the way there. So we had just developed self-driving technology really a few years, before that. It was a very new technology, and yet it had already been implemented and was already eliminating drivers. So that just I thought that was fascinating, and
Mhm.
it just the idea of thinking that, okay, so we've got this process where you can automate the mining, and then you automate the delivery of what you mine via truck, and you take it like to the port, and then you have like automated ports, and you put it onto like automated boats, and like there's all this automation that can happen quickly. And that got me thinking, what kind of future are we looking at here? So in my studies of what kind of options that we have, I came across basic income, and I was just shocked to read about all this evidence and stuff that already existed for it. Like I had no idea that we'd only passed a version of it under Nixon in the 70s, and that we had these ginormous social experiments. It was like our biggest experiments so far in the US back when we started with this, and we experimented this in cities all over. They were experiments in Seattle and Denver, and I'd lived in both those cities. I never heard of these experiments,
Mhm.
and we had experiments elsewhere in New Jersey and North Carolina and Gary, Indiana. And it was just like we really studied this, and we even not only did Nixon propose it, but this was passed in the House in 1970 and 1971. So like this is like a real idea, and of course we could have afforded it too, because we could have afforded it back when we almost did that in 1970, and since then we're already over twice as productive as we were then. And so it just I got into this and I started reading more about it, and it was just fascinating by the history of it and all the evidence out there for this. And that's just I became a moderator for the basic income subreddit, and at the time there were a couple hundred subscribers, and now there's over 50,000 subscribers. And so this conversation has grown quite a bit since when I got into it in 2013. It's really kind of exploded. And then there's experiments all around the world now. There's just so much more talk about it, and I've just been, researching and writing about it. Back in 2000, I think 14 maybe was the first time I really wrote something, and it was self-published. I think the first thing I published was a Medium. I also started up my own personal blog, and I just started writing and writing. And some things got shared a lot more than others, and I was asked to write for other platforms. And yeah, it's just I even in 2015, I began the process of crowdfunding my own basic income. And so for that whole year on Patreon, my goal was to crowdfund a $1,000 a month basic income. And so that anything I earn over that, I pledge to others making the same pledge to pledge to others who are crowdfunding their own basic incomes.
Wow,
So
that's cool.
yeah. So I achieved that. And in 2016, ever since 2016 in January, I've been receiving $1,000 a month as my basic floor income. And that's exactly what it is. It's that I'm still free to earn other income on top of it. But the fact is that I have that foundation, that floor, so that I always know that the next month I've got my basics covered. I'll be able to cover food and rent, and it allows me to focus on unpaid work. Like I can choose to write and do podcasts like this and just do all sorts of things that are non-remunerated. But because I have that income that allows me to do that, I'm able to do that. And then of course I can accept paid assignments, and I can do other things to earn money on top of it. But it enables me to do work, and that's something that I learned from it. And also the big thing I learned too is just it's really about security.
Mm-hmm.
It's this emotional feeling that it gives you. I think that this is something that people don't really appreciate until they have it. So unless you already have like Social Security or something that's non-withdrawable,
Right.
if you're earning like a dividend or a pension of some kind, that's there. Like it's this emotional feeling of knowing that no matter what, you've got like these basics covered. And it's just amazing that kind of difference that there's so much less stress in your life when you have that security. I think that's really what a lot of this conversation is about, creating is this sense of security in this world that's really growing more and more insecure as technology as advances, as the way that we work really is transformed from this old 20th century model of these 40-hour per week full-time careers that last for 10, 20, 30 years in one place, versus now where it's really just all this alternative work where you can have part-time jobs and in contractual jobs. Maybe it lasts for 6 months, or maybe it's some hours here and some hours there. Maybe it's gig labor, like driving for Uber. Like all of this, the way that we work has really been transformed, and it's really making people more and more insecure. So I think that's, again, an important element.
Yes. And what you said about Social Security, I remember reading one of your tweets that technically that could be a form of considered basic income. And that's very true. And I notice a difference since my mother now, she's been on basic or Social Security, as he almost called it, basic income for 5 years. And her, like you said, it is an emotional security, and the mental health, just your day-to-day state is so much more of, well, it's just a relief. It's a relief to know that no one can take that away from you, that that's there.
Yeah.
And you're exactly correct about that. And I was reading about the psychology behind this as well, is that it does give people like a base to where they can pursue and they can work themselves up. Everyone always talks about working yourself up. Well, that gives you a way to do it, is having a base.
Yeah. This idea of, pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
Right.
And like, you can't do that if you can't physically do that anyway. It's just,
that's true.
But just by the way that we talk about it is that, you have to have boots in order to pull yourself up.
Right.
And so when you say that to like someone with bare feet, it doesn't do any good. But if you give everybody boots, then you can actually say that you can pull yourself. You got to start with something. And that's what, if you look at like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I think is a really interesting way of looking at this, where we all have multiple needs. And like, if you look at the base, like we all start with, we have to eat, we've got to, sleep. We need to have a roof over our heads. We need clothing, warmth. Like these are the most basic stuff.
Mm.
And but you still have higher needs above that, but you essentially require those first needs to
Oh
reach
yeah.
those. So in order to say make friends and to engage in your community and to self-actualize, to learn, like you've got to cover those basics first. And so nobody stops there. Like nobody wants a life where all you do is eat and sleep indoors. Like that's just ridiculous. Nobody wants that. You use those basic needs that are met to go beyond. So if you think about it that way, there's just so much potential out there that's not being met because people are not having their basic needs met at the
Mhm.
beginning as a
Right.
starting point.
And you also mentioned about like the changing economy, like automated cars. Also, we see it in education because it's really hard now, especially in higher education, to get a salaried position, a permanent position.
Hmm.
They've switched to adjuncts,
Yeah.
and a lot of it is because a lot of things that's going on at higher universities, and it's very difficult to. 'Cause you'll teach 3 or 4 classes a semester. You will actually work more than tenured professors, but you'll have to have a second job to
Yeah.
survive. And that's something that has been going on for at least a decade now in higher education. And I know that firsthand because I used to be a collegiate English instructor.
Yeah.
And the only way you can really get a secure, especially in a state like Alabama, a secured position is if you know somebody. It's not the amount of credentials you have, like all the, knocks on a, or whatever, little ticks on a resume or CV. It's who you know in a state like, and it's probably that way to some extent everywhere, but
Mm.
Alabama is very, very, old network still. So I think basic income would be an answer to that social issue, that social problem as well.
Yeah, it's just crazy to think that there are adjunct professors with PhDs on food stamps because they're just
Mhm.
not earning enough money. And it kind of really challenges that notion that, in order to do well, in order to earn enough income, and in order to succeed in life, all you need is an education. Well, that's of course false because you can have a PhD and you can live in poverty, and you can
Right.
be working really hard with a PhD and you'll be living in poverty. So something's not right here. Basic income, by actually providing that floor, means that yeah, you can actually live above the poverty line as an adjunct professor. You can even have more bargaining power to actually demand more than what you're getting. I think is sort of a really big element of this is that people accept poverty wages because they don't really have any other choice.
Right.
you know so it's better to earn $10,000 a year than it is to earn nothing.
Mhm.
So you will accept these jobs with poor pay and poor conditions and in ridiculous hours and all these things is you don't have the ability to say no. So if you give people the ability to say no by actually unconditionally granting this income that's sufficient for their basic needs, then you give them that bargaining power. And that's
Right.
also why, you know, without that, you require things like minimum wage because you have to say, because people are willing to work for $4 an hour, for $5 an hour, they set this floor and say, okay, well, we have to, as the government, mandate that no one will work below this and employers have to pay this much. But if you have a basic income, you don't necessarily need that anymore. You can say, hey, if you want to work for $4 an hour because you love this job and you already have your basic needs met through the basic income, then you can do that. And there's also, if there's a job that nobody wants to do because it's just a horrible job that people don't like, then that job needs to pay more. That
Mhm.
job's going to have to pay $15 an hour, $20 an hour, $25 an hour, whatever, in order to attract employees to take that job. And then it's also interesting if you look at it that way, that also then incentivizes further automation because if humans are demanding now $20 an hour to do something that they were doing for minimum wage before, and a machine is effectively costs $15 an hour to do that job, then you can automate that job and then nobody has to do that anymore. And so I think that that's really kind of our goal that we should be looking at is that, here we are afraid of automation, but we should be embracing it. If we can eliminate half of our jobs, that's scary as long as we require jobs for income. If we no longer require jobs for income and we've decoupled income from jobs, then all of a sudden we can all work half as much if there's half as much, paid
Right.
employment to do. So we could be working 20-hour weeks as full time instead of 40-hour weeks. You know,
Yes.
I just think that makes more sense. If there's less work to do, then let's all work less. Why are we
Yeah.
still like
Yeah.
creating all these jobs that don't need to exist? Why are we? It's really weird to think that technology has advanced so much
Mhm.
over the past decades, and we're producing more now than ever, and yet people are finding it harder and harder to get by. It just doesn't make any sense.
Do you think what you were saying about the fact that people are still working more than what they have to, jobs they don't have to, well, they have to for a living wage, of course, but do you think a lot of that is because of this concept of a Protestant work ethic that we've kind of been sold since the inception of our country?
Yeah, it's a I would say it's a very convenient belief, say convenient for those who effectively own all the resources.
Mhm.
It's convenient for everyone else to have taken up this idea that work is meaning in itself, and that any kind of work at all is somehow better, and even suffering is somehow a good thing. You know, like if you are working 3 jobs for 100 hours a week, then that's like a really good thing, despite the fact that maybe it's all the jobs are poverty wages and you're still just barely getting by and you're living a horrible, miserable existence. You're depressed. The jobs themselves may not even need to exist. You know,
Right.
maybe you're working 100 hours doing like telemarketing or something. And like how there are a lot of jobs out there that are just entirely unnecessary. We've invented them because we need an income and we need to like justify our existence through toil and unnecessary or work, even though it's unnecessary. You know, we should be able to do work. We should be able to look at work differently. Like it's interesting to me how it's not considered work if you are watching, say, your own kid, but it is considered work if you're watching somebody else's kid.
Yes.
S- s-
Yes.
so
Good
you
point.
can you can imagine a situation where you're just swapping kids. So like, you know, it's your job is to say be a care worker, and each of you are watching each other's kids for money.
That is so messed up too. I mean, and that's what women do, right? It's
Yeah.
like the poor woman is expected to leave her child to go watch the rich woman's child so she can go off and be whatever she wants to be. It's just bizarre.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is. And so I think that part of our problem too is here we are thinking that work is so important, but it's like we're not defining it correctly. We're looking at paid would even say paid work. It's not always work, but you're looking at something that compensates you with money for your time as being valuable, always
Mhm.
valuable. Whereas stuff that is not compensated with money for your time oftentimes is not seen as valuable, but it's still work. So we just need to look at this differently and realize that you know we do want to seek meaning, and we do there is such a thing as good work, but it's just not automatically good work because you get a paycheck for it. And you know, we should be enabling people to pursue what's most meaningful to them.
Yeah, and this goes back to being more productive, what you were talking about. When people are happier and healthier and doing something that we actually can actually contribute something to our world, everyone's everyone's more productive and everyone's happier and healthier.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and you think most people would get that. How do you, so are there many models of basic income? Like how, for example, different countries that have it, like Finland. Finland is one that I understand has basic income. What would be various ways or types of models of basic income?
Sure. So I just wanted to get back really quick too with just the productivity and engagement, because I think that's a really
Okay.
important point. Is that it's kind of shocking that if you look at the entire world, at everybody is employed, only 15% of the workforce is engaged by their work. That's 15%. And so 85% of people are not engaged or actively disengaged by what they're doing for money. In the US, it's slightly higher, it's 33%. So one third of Americans are engaged by what they do, and the rest aren't. And yeah, that's a huge hit on productivity. If you're just doing work just to earn a paycheck, there's no passion, there's no motivation to like really do a great job and to just do something that matters. It's just all people kind of being cogs in a machine. So I think it's a huge hit to our productivity to be forcing people to do stuff that they don't care about. And if we actually allowed people to do that, then they would be engaged. In fact, there's a really interesting experiment that looks at just making something optional. And so what they did is they gave people the choice between two tasks. And they said, okay, so you can do this task or you can do this task. And we're gonna leave the room and we'll be back later to check up on you. And the other condition of this experiment was that it was the same thing where they said you can do this task, you can do this task, or you don't have to do anything. You can just sit here if you want to, and we'll be back later. So the only difference is that in one task, they were given no choice to do one of two things, and the other task, they were given the choice to do nothing. And they found that the people who had no choice to do nothing, they had to choose between one of the two tasks, they worked on average on those tasks for 5 minutes. In the other condition where they had the choice to not do those tasks, they worked on those tasks for an average of 7 minutes. So it was the exact same tasks, but people were more engaged by the work that they felt was entirely optional and they were voluntarily doing versus something that they felt that was not voluntary. So just that small thing, just being able to not do work, I think does a lot for productivity. Yeah, so to get to the question about various models around the world, there's certainly a lot of every country has to figure out how to implement this on their own, what makes sense for them, and it involves looking at their existing safety net or their existing systems, whatever that they're using, and to figure out a way of eliminating certain elements and transforming certain elements of their existing system to create the basic income in that system. And countries like Finland, they're experimenting right now. So it's not like everybody in Finland has a basic income. A couple thousand people, who are actually a couple thousand unemployed people, have been receiving a basic income that is unconditional, such so that when they accept work, they don't lose the benefit. And that's really the big difference here. And they just wanted to focus on unemployed people because they wanted to look at the effect on the work disincentive that the existing systems have. So just to get into that a little bit, right now, and this is like a big problem with welfare, is that because it's targeted,
you may have to adjust. You may have to adjust your wires or something. You're kind of crackling a little bit, just a little. Yeah.
So the problem with existing welfare programs, because they're targeted, is that you pull the incomes away with work. So effectively what you're doing is you're saying, okay, so here's $10,000 or here's $20,000 in benefits. And if you accept a $10,000 part-time job, you don't end up with $30,000 with the welfare system. You could end up with actually less than $10,000. You could end up with $8,000 total, in which case you're worse off accepting the job than you were being on welfare. So what's the point? It entirely disincentivizes work by targeting the benefit. And so if you allow people to keep whatever that they've been given, whatever that benefit is, so that they don't lose it, then that means if you start with $20,000, you take a $10,000 job, then you do have $30,000. You're $10,000 better off. So that's what they're looking at in Finland. They want to focus on seeing if people accept more temporary work, more part-time work. They want to see if by removing that disincentive, that you actually increase people's working.
So I think you're still a little bit fuzzy. It may be I may be hearing it on my end, but you may be, I don't know. But I can hear you.
Or something.
Yeah. We're supposed to be getting some storms in the southeast, and I know you're in New Orleans and I'm in Alabama, so there's something going on between us. But I can still hear you. I can still understand you.
Yeah,
So,
it's so beautiful out right now. Well, and that's not so beautiful. But, but yeah, okay. So Finland is experimenting with this right now. Canada is experimenting with this right now, and there are other experiments in the works. Scotland is working on designing an experiment. Give Directly, which is an NGO, is actually doing a huge 12-year UBI experiment in Kenya right now. And India is most likely going to start a UBI experiment or even just a UBI in one of their states at some point in the next 2 years. It's expected. They're really
wow.
interested in this. And so India is also a good example because when you're talking about implementation kind of details, their existing program is based around subsidies. So it's not like it's not like a whole lot of people have like our equivalent. They're not getting like food stamps. Instead, what they're getting is really cheap food, thanks to the government making food cheaper. And by doing it that way, we actually introduced a lot of problems because if you're just making food cheaper, then people can use that cheap food to make a profit off of it. You've got a lot of graft, and you've got people. This food doesn't reach everybody; it just reaches a lot of people. So it's like a really expensive and wasteful way of going about this versus the ability to just make sure everybody has enough cash to buy food in marketplaces. That's far more efficient, and there's far less leakages, and there's no ability for politicians and bureaucrats to skim off the top of these things because the money's going directly to people instead of through these middlemen.
And I've heard, and I agree with you completely. I've heard people, like, whenever that idea is proposed, like money straight to people so they can buy the food. I've heard, and I've heard it from both sides, classical, what we would call classical or neoliberals, or conservatives, Republicans, that they actually kind of want there to remain a really low class of person. And one of the worst, well, I guess early on, most surprising things I heard when I was an undergrad was someone's dad said that he actually believed that people who made below a certain income should not be allowed to buy steak or lobster.
Right. Yeah.
Whether you were on food stamps or not.
Right.
If you made below a certain income, like, I guess today it would be like $50,000 or something, like you should not be allowed to go and buy like a porterhouse steak.
That's ridiculous. Yeah.
And whether it be at grocery store or restaurant, there are people that actually believe that.
Yeah.
And is there any way, I don't think there is, but how do you address that? Or do you not? You just ignore people like that?
Yeah, so I think that comes out of this mentality. It's called a scarcity mentality. So I think that it's because we don't have a basic income, and because work is getting more and more insecure, that we're kind of like crabs in a bucket kind of thing as far as like trying to pull each other down. And we see that if you have a scarcity mentality, then you think that like the pie is limited. And so if somebody else has a slice, then that means your slice is smaller because they have a slice. So it's this mentality is saying that poor people are poor and they deserve to be poor, and that right. It's well-deserved punishment for the crime of being poor. And that's good because then they have more for themselves, and that you can feel better. And the fact that you're not poor, then if you look at it as being like the just world hypothesis, it's easier to get by every day. If you decide that the poor deserve it and that you don't because you're better, and then you don't have to feel guilty about that because obviously you deserve it. And that's like this just world hypothesis that we kind of subscribe to. And I think that if in a world with basic income, you eliminate the scarcity mentality. It's kind of like you go from a world of Mad Max to more of a Star Trek kind of world.
Right.
If everybody has enough, then you don't think of it that way. You don't think as like somebody has to lose in order for you to win. You can have they can win and you can win too. You know, it's a different kind of looking, different kind of way of looking at things.
Yeah, and I always tell people who are all for, this dog eat dog, this dog eat dog world, or, I win, 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 it's winner or loser. Well, not everyone wants the same thing.
Yeah.
So not we all don't want to grow up and be doctors. We
Right.
don't all want the same thing.
Yeah, or coders or engineers and these things. Like there's certainly we need artists, we need writers and investigative journalists, and these things don't necessarily pay money, especially right now in our existing system. Yeah, it's just a way of looking at work differently. But if you just want to get into this a bit as far as what causes this mentality of kind of us versus them, dog eat dog, and this goes back to kind of our baser animal instincts, to like our evolution. I think it's like a result of our fight or flight response. So this was a response that it's actually provided kind of a superpower back in the day, because what we would have like just in general terms, just in general day-to-day life, we're human beings and we're thinking long term, and suddenly, let's say you're at a watering hole or something, and you hear something. Well, those who were able to survive, like say a predator attack, those are the ones that you shifted from like this long-term thinking to like short-term, and you're like, okay, your heart starts beating faster, and your whole system changes so that you clench up and you can think faster and run faster suddenly, and that's this fight or flight response. And so it was very well adaptive back in the day, but here we are now, and we're still this fight or flight response is happening when we're, say, in our everyday lives, and there's, we're not going to be eaten by a lion, but our bodies are kind of acting that way. And what happens is that you shift this chronic state of stress, this insecurity leads to people thinking in short term, just surviving ways, and the other side of this is when you're thinking in these short-term ways, is that you seek out say levers of control. So if you feel the world around you, if you have no control over it, then that actually is like really bad for your health. That they've done tests with this on mammals and rats and things, and they see that if you create a stress response and you give them a lever, an actual physical lever that allows you to turn it off, then you're fine. But if you give the exact same stress to another rat who doesn't have a lever, and it's just they have no control over it whatsoever, even though the amount of stress is the same, they're going to be like just wearing their systems are going to be worn down. They're going to get sick, and because this lack of control. So the interesting thing about us as primates is that one way of exerting control is actually to form hierarchies and beat or bully the ones below us. To say that it's called displacement aggression. So if you're really stressed out, then you can actually reduce your stress and regain a sense of somewhat control by actually, say, beating someone else up below you. And I think that's what kind of we're seeing around us right now is this a lot more of this displacement aggression, especially I think against those who we consider to be others and below us, who are, say, immigrants, from another country here. We look at them as different, and that oh my gosh, like let's take out our stress on them. I think that's what we're kind of seeing around us right now.
We still have a very tribal mentality.
Yeah.
And as a collective, we still have our group minds, we still have our labels. And I'm realizing, just the last couple of years, I don't fit under a label. And the best people I know, and a friend said this to me, the best people I know don't fit under labels.
Yeah.
So, I'm wondering if it wouldn't just be healthy if a lot of people, a lot of us took a step back and re-examined our belief systems. And by that, I just don't mean, of course, religious, but belief systems like political. People usually don't think about their political opinions as being beliefs. But I think to really talk to people, we really have to do that and start finding that common ground. Well, we all need, like you said, a pair of boots.
Yeah.
So, and I like that metaphor actually a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, so this one of the reasons why I think eBay is such a powerful idea is because it's not left or right. I say it's not left or right; it's forward. It's beyond these kind of things. Because there's if you look on one side, you've got people like Martin Luther King Jr., who was talking about basic income before he was killed.
Yeah. And people don't even realize that about him, that he was really advocating for some class reform in this country. That was his next huge thing. And it's just, and this, like you said, this has been a conversation that's kind of been kept in the background for a very long time. And talking about left or right, you just mentioned both sides. The funny thing is, and it's both funny as an odd and funny as an haha to me, because a lot of my friends who are more liberal than I am are opposed to basic income.
Yeah.
But I have a couple friends who, one in particular who voted for Trump, who he would be okay with it. He has a master's in MBA or something, and he owns his own business. He's a small business owner, so he understands. He can talk to you, understand what you're saying, and he would respond better to a lot of things you're saying than some classical liberals I know. And 5 years ago, that would have blown my mind. But today I'm like, I totally get it. I totally understand. He even said to me, I'm all on board about universal health care. I just don't think we've found a way to implement it yet. Yeah. So see, even he's okay with that. It's, do you find that that's a thing that you just don't know who's going to be on board or your ally and the issue of basic income? Like, you don't know if it's going to be left or right. And have you seen more opposition actually on the left?
Oh yeah. So it's just fascinating to me to see that there's support on both sides, and there are people who hate the idea on both sides. And it's like I said, MLK supported it from the left, and you've got also Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek supporting it on the right. And Friedman and Hayek were like basically the founding fathers of neoliberalism. This was and they were free market. They were both free market economists who both won Nobel Prizes in economics. And so it's funny when you say someone from someone who's an actual communist, and they say, look, I don't like this idea because it perpetuates capitalism. And you'll say, well, it's you can say that, but at the same time, by actually providing people the power to say no, and actually breaking this connection between work and income so that you're actually paying everyone an income no matter what, then you're actually enabling so much more activism, and you're enabling greater bargaining power, and you're even creating a universal strike fund for people. So you can look at it from that way. And for those who are against it, and it's funny too, when those on the left who are against it, they'll say something like it's a neoliberal idea. And well, Martin Luther King Jr. certainly wasn't a neoliberal, and he felt very strongly about this because he felt it was important to eliminate poverty in order to accomplish so many other things. And on the other side, you've got people on the right, let's say, they have just heard about this, and maybe they've heard about it through Fox News or something. And then the way it's presented is universal, welfare, and then suddenly, oh, that's a terrible idea, and it's a leftist idea. It's those damn progressives are just getting worse and worse and worse. And it's well, obviously they don't know that Milton Friedman and Hayek supported it, and why they supported it as a replacement for welfare, and as the ability to actually increase or remove the disincentives to work that welfare creates. And so it's I think a lot of this is that it shows people's say ability to think critically about what they read, about what they hear, and to form their own opinions based on like kind of independent research. There's a lot of reflexive responses to this idea, and it greatly depends on how it's first presented to you. But one thing I think is really interesting about this idea too is that I think I see it, it kind of functions as a seed. So you may have heard about this idea in a certain way, but now you know about it, and then you're thinking about it, and maybe it comes up again and again and again, or maybe you read some piece of news that you connect. So just as an example, how just I think it was just a couple of days ago, released this news of the first study of evictions in the U.S. and that last year, I think it was like a few million people were evicted from their homes. And so you think about this, and you're like, if you know about basic income, then you know that obviously there's a connection there, and that those evictions would be far, far fewer if they had a basic income. And so you're like, oh, well, that's another thing you can help with. And then you see something else, you're like, that's another thing you can help with. And you start to build these up, and you're like, well, this actually makes a lot of sense, especially if we, do this and this as part of it, then yeah, that's actually pretty smart. So I see a lot of people actually change their minds over time, and it can take, some years, but I do see a lot of people changing their minds just the more they think about it and the more that they're able to process it.
Right.
It's just a kind of first reflexive opinion. And it's also, like you said, with far as like our tribalistic thinking, if your tribe is against it and you've got like your tribal leaders writing stuff against it, then you're more likely to not like the idea. But hopefully over time you can start to look at it for yourself, and people will be seeing about and seeing more sides of this. And it's funny to one way to actually get people to think about these things differently are like the anti pieces from the other side. So if someone on the right is worried that basic income is communism, and then they come across a piece from a communist who's claiming that basic income will perpetuate capitalism, then they can look at that and go, well, wait a second, that doesn't make any sense. Something's not right here. If communists hate the idea, maybe I should give that a second thought.
Right. Yeah. And that's another thing. People want to confuse and conflate this with communism, and it's not communism.
Yeah.
Like you said, a lot of people can consider it, encouraging capitalism even.
Yeah, that's actually one of the biggest effects, and something that I've seen. It's almost like a universal effect, is that self-employment goes up. So in the media UBI experiment, self-employment went up 301%. In the India UBI experiment, those in villages who received the basic income were 3 times as likely to start up a new business than those that could control villages who didn't. And if you look at, there was something that's very similar to a basic income provided in Liberia, and people were 3 times as likely to start their own business. And so like over and over and over again, you see that people use money that is unconditionally provided in order to invest in capital, in order to pursue the jobs that they wish to pursue. So there is like, they shift from wage labor to self-labor. And I think it kind of says a lot about us as people, where people aren't lazy. It's just that they don't want to be forced to work to do someone else's work. What they want to do is do what's important to them. They have their own idea. They're like, I want to start a restaurant, or I want to record my own album, or there's so many things people want to do. And yeah, if your only choice is to work for someone else, that's what makes people lazy. Like, why would you want to do someone else's bidding? It's anti-freedom.
That is, yeah. No, I agree. And I see basic income. I'm kind of I can see every little detail, but I can also kind of see the whole web outline, like the entire picture through a web network. You know, it's when you're in school and you're a kid, they make you do the web outlines. I can kind of see that with basic income, where you use that. There are so many ways that all the, you know, you talk about human rights violations that are going on right now. If people had a means to take care of their needs and their family, then a lot of that's going to take care of a lot of crime and a lot of human rights violations.
Yeah.
And that is right there is the, sorry, my cat. That right there is the winning point for me. And it's interesting because talking about like the early 20th century, you know, a lot of the socialism that was going on in our country, the little experiments that led to really bad things. And then, you know, especially this past week, we had the anniversary of the Holocaust, and how economics has always affected us to where in a lot of ways it's brought out the worst in us when we have these models of societies that just don't work. And it actually creates human rights violations like human trafficking, war, and all these other horrible things. And I don't know where I was going with that. I guess I just really just seeing that connection, how this is, I'm not saying that it's going to you know, end everything or be the answer for everything, but this is basic income is a beginning to coming up with an end to a lot of bad things.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Is that you know, UBI? People say, "Oh, UBI is a silver bullet," and it's like, well, no, it's not a silver bullet. We're not trying to kill a werewolf here. This is not a mystical, you know, creature that we need something magical for that to do everything for us all at once. Like, but if there's something that we can use as a tool that actually decreases just boatloads of problems,
right?
And why would we not do that?
That's my question. Like, why? I don't know if we're ever going to get a response that satisfies us, but why?
Yeah, and just to your point too about like human trafficking and just how powerful this ability to say no is. There's something horrible going on in Europe. And I can't remember if it's the farmers in Italy or France, and where exactly most are coming from. I think most of the immigrants, like the farm labor, is coming from Eastern Europe. I think it's I can't remember where in Eastern Europe. Let's just say Eastern Europe, so that's correct. Anyways, so these women and their families, so you've got couples coming over and with their kids, and they're working on farms, and the owners of these farms are men, and they are they're you know they're forcing these women to have sex with them under the pretense, you know, that look, if you don't have sex with me, then you know I'm going to fire you. So these women are having sex with their, you know, the owners of the farms, because they have no choice, and even the husbands are okay with that because, like, you know, they're not okay with that, but I mean, like, they're talking about it and they're like, well, I mean, what else can we do? We don't really have any other choice. And so then these women are even getting pregnant, and the owners are like, the owners of the farms are taking them to, you know, abortion clinics. You know, it's like, hey, you've got to get an abortion because, you know, you can't have that. And it's just like, just think about how just messed up that is, just all around, simply because the women and their husbands too don't have the ability to just tell these owners of the farms to just go screw themselves. Like, just, you know, screw you. We're not doing that. You don't get to exhibit that level of domination over me. I don't need this. I have a basic income. It's just amazing to think how much coercion, how much just horrible things happen in
you
the
know,
world because people can't say no.
Yeah, because people can't say no, and a lot of it is because people can't say no, and people, classical liberals in general, which has surprised me because I thought that I fit under that category. Apparently, I don't. Past almost 3 years this fall, I found myself a human rights activist accidentally because I spoke out against an issue that's been ongoing in the South. Even past the mid-century, there were still forced private adoptions. No DHR, no social services, no one did anything wrong, just for being unwed and or poor. There are still forced adoptions, the stuff that happened in the mid-century everywhere in our state in particular, but also in the Southeast. And a lot of that is because of one law in Alabama called pre-birth consent. And I don't want to get into that and hijack the podcast because it's about you, not about this issue at hand. But everything you're saying, if we had basic income, women would never have found themselves in that position in the first place. Yeah, exactly. Not only that, but the forced adoptions that are ongoing, people, they don't believe what you said about coercion. They actually believe that coercion is a choice. And it's been classical liberals who have made that argument. Well, they chose. I'm like, but if it's the only option, if it's the only choice, is it a choice?
Right.
Is it a choice? And resources are very, very limited, especially in South Alabama where this is going on. And it's not like, you can just drive to an abortion clinic or you can go get birth control like that. As in the deep South, those choices are very limited. And that's another thing, getting people to understand, if without any resources like basic income, it's hard to find a way to get access to those choices.
Yeah.
And not only that, it's also leading into, and I know you're aware probably of this, of surrogacy. Alabama, South Alabama is there's a certain agency that it's a self-dealing agency, but they're also doing surrogacies too. And when I bring this issue to people who do have a media outlet or who do know about it, and they see the facts, they know it's poor women, they know it's poor Southern women, they know that a lot of these people are just barely making it. And they said, well, it's their choice. They keep on saying that to me. It's their choice. And just what you said, they don't have a means to say no. And basic income would give these women and these families a means to say no.
Yeah, no, there does not exist free choice without the ability to say no. And you can just give an example of, say, like, is it considered consensual sex if someone is, say, tied up and gagged or whatever, and then you ask them, well, we're gonna have sex now, and if you don't want to, then just say no. But they can't say no, so you're like, oh well, I guess that means yes. And so no one would say that was consensual. If your partner does not have the ability to refuse this encounter, it's just a fundamental aspect of free choice, is that it's not only about saying yes to something, it's about being able to say no to it as well. It's just really important. Anyone who cares about freedom and liberty, these things that we claim to uphold as important, then you have to be able to say no to people. It's just a fundamental aspect. It's interesting too that you mentioned these examples. I think there's a lot of these examples that people are either they don't care to look for, or they think that it used to exist and now it doesn't.
Right.
Like debtors' prisons is another example. I feel like people feel, oh, that's illegal. You can't end up in prison and have enough money. It's like, well, no, you totally can.
Yes,
a lot of innocent people are in jail simply because they can't afford to pay the fee to be out of jail. And how messed up is that? That here we are as a society that's like, either we don't recognize that that's a problem, or we do, and we're totally okay with the fact that we're spending the equivalent of, say, $40,000 a year on people in jail and prison instead of giving them $12,000 a year instead. And so we're spending so much more money than we would otherwise need to be to attain just horrible outcomes versus what they could be.
Yeah, everything you're saying is making so much sense to me. And I hope anyone that listens, because what I've seen about the last 3 years, I mean, it's basic income would really, like I said, it would knock it down pretty hard. It'd make it wouldn't be a cure all because you're always going to have bad people that want to do bad things, you know, but it would give people the ability to say no.
Mhm.
And
Yeah. And people just make better decisions too, and we know this even from the evidence. So, and this is again, like I'm very evidence oriented, and it's I like people may think, oh, he's an ideologue that believes in basic income and nothing else. It's like, well, no, I came about this through the evidence. I'm always been very scientifically minded, and what I care about is if stuff actually works or it doesn't.
right.
And so everything I've found researching this is just one thing after another of saying it works, it works, it works, it works, it works in all these different ways. So as one example of how it works is, people say, oh, if you just give people money, then they're going to use it on drugs and alcohol, of course, because those are great things that everybody loves to do, and they're stupid. And I'm not stupid, so I wouldn't do that, but they would do that because they're stupid. Like that's this belief. And but if you look at the evidence, then it's really interesting. There was a meta-analysis done. So this was a meta-analysis is essentially a study of lots of studies. So this is a lot of data, and the result of this that shows that people slightly reduced their use of goods like alcohol and drugs and tobacco and these things if they were given an unconditional cash grant. And so, oh, that doesn't, make any sense. Why would that happen if obviously, they're impoverished and they're making poor decisions. That's who they are. And so if you give them money, then they'll make even more poor decisions. But what happens, the mechanism, again, it goes back to the stress response. So if you give people an unconditional basic income, then they're not worried about being able to come up with enough money to live. You lift this weight off of their shoulders, and because of that, stress is reduced. Then they're not looking for drugs as a control lever for their stress, which is another thing. So there's displacement aggression is one way of controlling your stress, and another one is self-medication.
Or escapism. It's basically drugs and alcohol abuse. That's just a form of escape.
Yeah, like all addictive behavior comes down to this, is that you're self-medicating. And this, even if you're like addicted to shopping, or you're addicted to porn, or you're addicted to just pretty much anything. It's if there's a behavior that you do over and over and over and over and over again, it's usually as a means of, even if unbeknownst to you, it's a means of like reducing your stress. It helps in some way to feel that there's some control. And it's interesting, if you're judging, like there's so much judgment of people who are like you said, even if you're earning under a certain amount, so you can't buy steak, or like, oh, it's a horrible decision for someone who's poor to buy cigarettes because cigarettes are so expensive. And it's like, the act of buying a cigarette or buying like one beer, it's a way of like feeling human. It's a way of gaining control, of saying that, everything else around in my life I can't control, but I can control this one thing.
Right.
So I'm going to do this. And that's what it really comes down to. And if you look at the evidence of this, it shows that that's true. And that if you just give people cash, they don't waste it. It actually improves their lives to the point where they aren't making these decisions that you otherwise would have considered to be a poor decision.
And we touched on this earlier, but how to sort of explain this to somebody, because being in Alabama, I'm going to get this. I have gotten this. How do you explain to people this is not communism? Like, what if you could break it down into like a paragraph?
Sure. So as far as like the communism thing, I think the best example of UBI anywhere in the world right now is in Alaska. And it's been there since 1982. So Alaska, as we all know, is not a communist state. It's a red state, but it's not that kind of red state. They've been receiving everyone there, rich and poor, has been receiving a dividend since 1982. And so that's their income floor. So everyone else in the US has an income floor of $0. But in the state of Alaska, everyone has an income floor
Mhm.
that varies from around $1,000 to $2,000 per year. And so it's not a huge income floor, but it is something. And it does make quite a difference. It reduces poverty, it reduces inequality. And they also have, they're usually right up at the top as far as highest well being. And
Mhm.
so, and well-being is measured by the ability to enjoy what you're doing for work because you're choosing to do it.
Right,
It's being able
right.
to engage in community, socialize with friends. All these things require money and require security. So you see this effect there in Alaska, and so yeah, that they're being provided money, and people get the money and then they spend it in markets. So this is not, the government is not telling anybody what to do. And you say if you really want to get down to this, like if you look at communism, they weren't giving people cash at all. If you're talking about USSR, it was more like a job guarantee kind of thing, where they're saying that, what's the joke that they pretended to work for the government and the government pretended to pay them.
Mhm.
Like everybody in communist Russia, everybody had to work in order to eat. That was the credo, and you didn't
Right.
get you were given like food, like you lined up for like soup and bread lines and these things. Like this is not a market oriented economy. In Alaska, you get your money and you go off and you go shopping for what you decide that you need. And even if you look at like our food stamp program, it's interesting. Like the history of it was a pro business response to the problem that people were receiving literal handouts of food from the back of trucks in the Great
Mhm.
Depression. And so if you're being given free food, you're not going to the grocery store. And so then you're all these markets are suffering because they don't have customers. And it's inefficient, and it's anti-capitalistic. So they said, well, let's just give people the means to go to markets and purchase food there instead of getting free food from the back of trucks. That was the origins of food stamps in the US. It was they even looked at it as a way of teaching like capitalism to the
Yeah.
public because they were able to purchase stuff in markets. It's just very market friendly. It requires markets, and just the way markets work themselves. It's
Right.
if you look at supply and demand, the way that it works so well is because essentially it's like a democracy where people are voting for the goods and services that they like, and they're not voting for the goods and services that they don't like. So, if you own a business and you're making a good product and people are spending money there, then they're voting for you and you're able to do well and people are able to get what you're selling. That's capitalism. And so an interesting element to this is that UBI actually improves the way markets work. And this is something that I don't think a lot of people get who would accuse it as being capitalism. It's actually extremely good for markets. And so the reason this is that markets can't tell the difference between a no vote and a null vote. And so what that means is that, let's say you create a store, you're selling ice cream.
Mhm.
And it's like, your mom's recipe and it's wonderful and everybody loves it. And so you start selling this and you just don't have enough customers. People aren't coming in. So does that mean that people don't like the ice cream, or does it mean they don't have money?
Right, right.
So if you make sure that everybody has enough money, then suddenly the only possibility is that they don't like your ice cream if people don't come in.
Mhm.
So in order to have a functioning market, you have to make sure that all the customers in the market, all the participants in the market, have enough means of voting within the market for it to work. Just look at Monopoly. Monopoly is a game about capitalism, and you start the game with a bunch of money, and then every time you circle the board, you get more money. Would the game work if you start the game with nothing? Would the game work
Yeah.
if you don't get money for passing go?
See
Like
that
you have to
that's a
feed
good
that.
one. That's a good one actually, because I was looking for like a couple concise lines, because they're not going to give me a long time to
Right.
explain it to them. Like Monopoly, that or either the I like the what you said about communism. Like you're actually working for the government and they're giving you food. They're not giving you money. They're actually giving you what they want to give you. You don't go and pick it out.
Yeah.
So
There's no
and
choice involved.
yeah, no, and we go back to choice and freedom and liberty and stuff like that, and that they can latch onto.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's
Yeah.
true.
And see, that's the reason why I feel that it's really important for those on the left and the right to actually get together and work
Hmm.
together on this instead of thinking of each other as different tribes.
Hmm.
Because if you look on the left, like, you've got people against the idea because they're the ones who have like more of an authoritarian personality. Like they believe that poor people can't make their own decisions and
Right.
that people need their decisions made for them. And so, but the right does not believe that, although there are some on the right who are also authoritarian personalities too, but there are also many on the right who believe it's far more important that you not control people's decisions,
Right.
that
Right.
freedom and choice are fundamental. And it's really important that not be the case, that you have those decision makers. So it's those on the left who are pro basic income need to work with those on the right who are pro basic income to make sure that the basic income happens and that we get it in a way that's actually basic income instead of like these alternatives that the left are pushing, like universal basic services, which is saying that,
Right.
no, we shouldn't give people cash. No, instead we should give people free travel and transportation and actual food and free clothing and like all these things that, again, there's no choice involved with them, and you're destroying markets by doing that. And
Hmm.
it's very controlling.
It is very controlling, and that's one thing that really makes me very hesitant to, I was a delegate. I signed up to be a delegate for Bernie Sanders for Alabama. That
Mm,
was that was something for Alabama. But some of the rhetoric and some of the ideas on the left regarding how they're going to implement social change and provide universal everything is like you just said,
yeah,
it's not about free will or free choice or whatever you want to call it. It's just not about freedom or liberties or anything like that. It's more about the control.
yeah, and it's interesting. You have to look at like personalities and psychology and why people might believe this kind of thing. And so there's a couple things. So on the one hand, I think that there's like if you like have spent decades, say, like quote fighting poverty, as in you've been trying to help poor people in a way that makes their decisions for them, it's really hard to suddenly come around and say that, why have I been doing this? I should have just been letting them make their own decisions. You know, because all the evidence shows that that's what I should have been doing. So you can't see that. It's really hard to,
Right.
like, what does that say about you if you have if you see that yourself as having value and that you're a good person because you've been trying to help people, but in the way that you've been doing it has actually been hurting people, or at least not helping them as much as you could be. So it makes it hard to see that. It's like an identity crisis kind of thing to
Yeah.
to look at this and be like, who am I as a person? And as long as we're looking at identity crises too, I think that's kind of really that's part of the challenge of the present and future of work and the transformation of work
Mhm.
too. I think that we've had decades of creating a culture, a society where you've been, from you go through K through 12, and it's like the goal is to create a product of a person who can work in a factory, who can pull the same lever over and over and over again without going crazy. And so you don't want to create people who are critical thinkers. You don't want people to like question the system. You just want obedient workers. And
Mhm.
so we've had this society cranking out obedient workers. And if you get a whole society full of obedient workers and you get them thinking about the fear and potential of them being out of work, then this is an existential crisis because you're thinking,
Mhm.
what am like you've been brought up and raised in this whole culture has created these individuals who it's really hard to think about what their purpose is. What their purpose is not to pull a lever over and over again. What is their purpose? And that's a tough question for a lot of people. So I think that as we go forward, it's about we have to shift the way that we educate our children, so that we
Mhm.
create generation after generation of those who actually think critically, who don't accept authority, who are evidence oriented, and who are creative thinkers. They think outside the box. Like this is going to be a really challenge for us because we do need to create a society where people are really thinking about who am I? What is my purpose? How do I achieve that purpose? And that really gets down to what basic income is. It's so what would you do if you had a basic income? What is it that you're not doing right now because you're not starting each month with enough money to live? Is it are you your job doing whatever that you're just kind of going through life not so much thinking about, or are you who you are in a way that you haven't even found yet, that you haven't discovered yet? That who can you be, what can you contribute to your community and to society, and just to make you a better you. And I think these are some really interesting kind of philosophical, existential kind of questions.
I agree. And as far as critical thinking, I've taught developmental classes and adult reading comprehension, developmental grammar, and all that. It's interesting because just a little side note about critical thinking. I had a pretty decent book for a reading comprehension class, adult reading comprehension class,
Mhm.
and it had it listed all the logical fallacies. It introduced them to logic and rhetoric, and we had a section on study habits and how to develop a sense of how you study, just not the actual words and definitions and
Mm.
putting it all together in your brain, but it actually taught critical thinking. Okay, now it's together. How do I unpack it and make sense of it, and how do I, if I want to agree or not or disagree with it.
Mm.
And the interesting thing, that book, um, after the head of our department watched me teach a class with this book, and she was like, "Wow, that's really cool." She got rid of that book because she said these people can't handle that.
Right.
She
Yeah, they
said
can't handle it.
that's you did a really good job, and they really liked it. They were really engaged, and but they can't handle things like logic, Amber. They can't handle stuff like that. You know
Yeah.
what they are. It's a head of a department
Yeah.
in college here said that to
Yeah.
me, and they did handle it. They did get it. They all passed. I mean, I know I'm the one who graded them,
Yeah.
and I'm like, but they made A's and B's. What do you mean they are not getting it? And it's like there's this opposition, and I wonder if that's something ingrained. What we were saying about tribalism, or no one can rise above me. I still have to remain up here and have to make sure that the members of my tribe, my kids, remain up here, and everyone else down there.
Yeah.
But I do see that. I see this opposition to actually teaching critical thinking, and that's scary.
Yeah. Like I guess I would look at this from like there's perspective of there are some people who they're in the positions that they are, and let's say they see themselves as helping people, And so, even if you look at this as from like the act of charity itself, like that if you give something to someone, then you can see it, you can do it because you're doing it to help them. But at the same time, you can see it as then the act of you giving means that you're better than them. And so you are not the one in need. They're the one in need. And so you're the giver. And so it lifts your stature. It's a hierarchical. You're able to raise
Right.
yourself up. And that makes you feel better. So there's a selfishness that can be involved in certain things. Like maybe she's the type of person who she gets her value, and she doesn't see it this way, but she gets her value from people being below her. So
Right.
and it's a terrible way of teaching. To think that the goal of a teacher is to get kids to think. That's really like if you can teach kids how to think for themselves, you're the greatest teacher. If you're in the situation where you're wanting to like basically get everyone to think what you think, and it's like the function of that is to put yourself above them, that you enjoy that kind of authoritative status where people accept what you say, then that you're enjoying teaching for the wrong reasons.
Oh, definitely.
So yeah, I think there's a lot of people in a lot of positions where they're doing it because it makes them feel higher in the hierarchy.
And I guess I'm trying to segue into, since we're talking about hierarchies and stuff, how do we come from this mentality, this society, this economic system where we do have hierarchies, to basically what would be the best way, or one of the best ways, to integrate basic income, for us to switch, for us to transition as a society
Yeah.
to basic income, whether we're going from welfare system and replacing that, or just everyone just get basic income across the board.
Yeah, yeah. So obviously, I feel the goal that we should be aiming for is a poverty level basic income to start with, and so in the U.S. that would be around $1,000 per month. However, just because that's our goal doesn't mean we can't do other things along the way that approach that goal. And I think personally, I think the best way of making a big step towards that goal is a carbon fee and dividend approach. So I see this as like a three birds one stone kind of policy, where you make it more expensive to pollute the air with greenhouse gases, by adding this carbon tax. Let's say at your major points of entry. So the effect of it. Let's say if you add like $100 per ton tax, then your prices are going to go up. And so let's say gas goes up $1 per gallon with that much. So if gas goes up $1 per gallon, you're going to drive less. And so the problem with the carbon tax that's always been its biggest problem is that it's regressive because it hurts those who are poorest the most. If you can barely afford to get by each month and all your costs go up, then obviously you're going to be worse off. And but we want to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So what do? Well, so the thing is that you do it in a revenue neutral way. So you add this tax, and then you provide the revenue of that tax. Instead of going to government, it goes to everyone as a dividend, like in Alaska. And if the result of that is that makes it progressive. So now if you're the poorest person, then your costs actually went up far less than the amount of new income that you're receiving through the dividend. And so again, this is a market-based approach to climate change, because government is not deciding to regulate something. It's not making a decision. It's not choosing winners and losers. It's just making it more expensive to have a higher carbon footprint, and it's giving people the choice of what to do with it. So let's say if you again, it's a matter of choices. So like, let's say you 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 have to choose between gas going up, and so um, and you have your money that goes along with it. So do you want to keep your money and to use it for the more expensive gas, in which case there's no change for you. You're still
Mhm.
doing the same behaviors. Or do you want to take that money that you're getting and use it elsewhere and then reduce your carbon footprint? So that's like a new choice that's created from this. And if we did this, we could do a universal, carbon tax and dividend scheme in the U.S. And depending on what the amount is that you decide to set it at, and this would actually grow year after year after year. That's one of the benefits too, is that businesses can know far in advance what this rate's going to be. If you do that, then we could have like a carbon dividend of say $50 a month, $100 a month,
Mhm.
$200 a month. It all depends on the amount, of the carbon tax. And so that's if you're looking at a $200 per month dividend, then you're already a fifth of the way there to a full UBI. And then also, let's say it makes it that much cheaper to pass the UBI, because now actually you're only looking at funding $800 worth instead of $1,000 worth, because you already have the $200 a month dividend. So I see that I see a carbon dividend as like a really common sense, just brilliant way to get immediately, because we can do this at any point. You just immediately pass it because it's a revenue neutral carbon tax. Just do it, and boom, you start receiving the income, and you're already a part of the way there. At the same time, you're reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and we're like saving ourselves. So I
Right.
love that idea. It's a great idea. And then there's also another thing that we could do, and it's not as talked about. It's called, you can refer to as citizen seigniorage or sovereign money. But it's this idea of really kind of questioning and looking at money itself. Like,
Mhm.
what is money? How do we create it? Right now, unbeknownst to most people, it's not government that's creating most money. It's banks. Banks create most of the money through actual people taking out loans. You take out debt and you actually create money. 97% of the money supply is actually created in this way by banks. And banks are freely creating all this money. And
Mhm.
then not only are they getting the benefit from that, but they're also, charging interest on it too.
Right.
So why are we doing this way? What if we're going to expand the money supply, which we do need to in order to have an expanding economy? Why don't we just do it ourselves? Just remove the ability of banks to do this, which would also be its own good, because then banks, when they crash, like they did in the last major crisis, they don't bring the entire economy down with them, because banks would be serving the function of actually lending out existing money. They have to have that money in their vaults, and then they lend it out. That they wouldn't be creating all this money on top of it. So you'd be stabilize the system as well. And so if we just created money out of credit instead of debt and distributed it universally, then you could expand the money supply at the same rate we're doing right now. And instead of creating debt and instead of creating instability, you would be providing everyone around, say, $100 to $200 a month in newly created money that's not done in an inflationary way. This is not like expanding the money supply more than it already is. It's just removing the ability of banks to expand the money supply and instead just expanding it at a steady rate on its own. So I think that's a really interesting way to go about this too, because again, it's not tax funded. So people who hate taxes don't have to have a problem with this.
Mhm.
And a lot of people don't like banks and the fact that they're
Sure.
charging interest. And, the bankers aren't exactly everyone's favorite people. So, just stop their ability to create money, create it ourselves. That would I think that in itself would
Yeah, I
also
like that one.
fix a lot of problems too. So another kind of two birds, one stone kind of approach. Um, so if you did both of those, then you're almost like halfway to a full basic income.
Mhm.
In which case, it's that much easier to just say, well, let's actually just neutralize what we're doing. Instead of doing um, uh, temporary assistance for needy families, instead of food stamps, instead of Section 8, instead of um, the credits like the earned income tax credit, instead of child deduction and child tax credit.
Mm.
All these programs in both that are welfare programs and also these programs within the tax code, all these subsidies, just eliminate those, universalize it, and cash it, and you could create the full basic income. So yeah, so that's the way that I would go about it, is kind of these kind of smaller steps along the way, still fighting for the main big goal. But anything that is a step forward, where it's fully universal and people see it as, say, their right, like in Alaska,
Mhm.
versus some kind of welfare program
Right.
or charity of some kind, then that's what I like. Is if we do it in a way that people perceive it as welfare or some kind of charity, then I don't see that as being as much of a step towards basic income. I think it'd just be more problematic. So, like, some people believe that we should expand the earned income tax credit
Mhm.
as being a way forward. And I agree that that would be an improvement, of course, to the existing system, but it's also within the existing system. It doesn't make people look at it differently. There's no perceptual difference.
Right.
And I think that that's really the fight that we need to make, is this changing of perceptions. It's odd to me that here we are, like the recent idea about giving people boxes full of food shipped to their doors instead of food stamps. That's just, it's ridiculous to me. It's
Right. Right.
it's it's not even conservative.
And
It's
yeah, because it doesn't support local small businesses like our
Right.
farmers
It's
market.
it's hurting them. It's
Right.
hurting small businesses because
It is.
people would no longer, they would lose all their food stamp customers. Everyone with an
Mhm.
EBD card would no longer be welcome in these places. They wouldn't have any money. So that would actually close down stores that rely on this. It could be the difference between shutting down and staying open for business, which would then screw over everyone who is not on EBT and everyone else, because those stores close down. So it's a terrible idea. And most recently, Trump signed just the executive order, I think yesterday, um, where yesterday or yesterday, about applying work requirements for all welfare programs. And the thing is about that, like that too, it's it's something that people may feel like feels right. Like, well, gosh, if you're getting welfare, you should work for it. Like you're receiving this handout, and obviously it shouldn't be free. You should work for it. And if you look at that, and work incentives, work requirements don't actually work in the way people think that they do. It has all these negative repercussions. Like, it depresses wages, for one thing. It depresses everybody's wages, because if you have to get a job no matter what, that means it's you have to accept any wage no matter
Mhm.
what. There's no
Right.
bargaining power, so you're just going to say, oh well, yeah, I'll work for minimum wage. Whereas that job could have paid more than minimum wage if people weren't forced to work. That's just one kind of negative outcome of these work requirements. But it's harmful, and again, it frustrates me that that those who pretend to care about that freedom and liberty and choice, um, would be okay with, essentially, with wage slavery, saying that no, people should be forced to work. They should not have the ability to
Right.
refuse this job that is a horrible job and may not even need to exist. They should have to accept it in order to receive money. And it's just the incentives are all wrong. It reduces the amount of self-employment, and it hurts small business, and it's expensive. It's far more expensive than, you have to have all these bureaucrats and administrative costs, and it's just a mess. And there's no reason for it to be a giant mess. It's just, if you just trust people and provide them enough income to not live in poverty, then just all these things are corrected in a major way.
And of course, this is going to be a question that you've probably gotten and will probably get, in the future. What about with a society with basic income where we would like to be? How do you factor in like dependents, like wife, children, and all that? Because someone's going to ask me that.
Yeah. So first of all, a key element of basic income is that it's per individual. So everyone will receive, it's not per household, it's per person in a household. And so, say a married couple, each would receive a basic income through their own individual bank accounts. And then if you look at children, the way I think that should be done is I think that there should be a child's basic income as well. So a lot of people look at basic income as being for only those who are 18 and over. But the thing is, if you only do it that way, then it doesn't scale per household, and you still have households who are subjected to poverty, and you'd also still have to maintain all these programs meant to help kids and parents with dependents. So if you really want to reform the system, and this is also actually a good step, another step forward, and so you ask, like, as aside from a carbon dividend and aside from creating credit money instead of debt money, if you actually, this would be mostly revenue neutral, but we could actually take programs like food stamps and WIC, and you take programs like EITC that scale per kid. You take your child tax credit, your child tax deductions, all the various deductions oriented at kids, and you just universalize it, cash it out, and provide everyone under 18 a basic income, through their parents of around $4,000 per year, around $350 or so, per month. Then we're essentially already doing that, but again, we're in a mess full of ways. There's all sorts of programs across a whole range of things, and even it's weird too that the results of the way that we currently do things are that we essentially value the kids of like the middle class more than we do the poor, because if you earn enough money, then it deducts from your taxes, and so like the equivalent of cash is actually higher than what those living under poverty receive in cash. So it doesn't really even make any sense the way that we're doing it. So again, we're doing it in an expensive way with bureaucracy-filled programs, bigger government than we need to. All we have to do is just cash it out, provide it's also called a child allowance, and there's actually a lot of countries around the world already do that. So it's a very common actual program. We're just not the ones who have done it yet. Like Canada already has a child allowance and also a senior benefit as well. So for them, in order to enact basic income in Canada, they're really just looking at from 18 to 65 or whatever, because they've already covered the basic income for those younger and older than that. In the U.S., we don't really have that, so there's more reform that we need to do. But I think that just makes a whole lot of sense to do this, this child-based income. And people hear that too, and they think, oh, well, that's crazy, because then you'll just have people breeding for money. Yeah. Like fertility rates would just skyrocket if you did that.
And no, you would not every woman wants to have 5 children. I can assure them that.
Right. And again, not only is there a misunderstanding of that, of behavior, but it's also like a lack of knowledge of what the evidence shows, and it's also a lack of knowledge of what like the incentives are. So if you just let's look at the incentives. So right now we have a system that's designed around pretty much only helping people if they have kids. It's like we don't feel people are worth anything unless they have kids, unless they are like a family or whatever. and then they're deserving of some kind of assistance. So if you look at like the earned income tax credit is a great example. Like if you're a single adult and you're living below the poverty line, you get virtually nothing from
Right.
the earned income tax credit. If you have a couple kids, then you do actually benefit quite a bit from the earned income tax credit, as long as you're earning close to the poverty line. It's very helpful. So it's weird how the way that we have set things up is that you're essentially you get zero, you get nothing, you're not worth anything. And then if you have a kid, let's say you get like $16,000 worth of benefits.
Mm-hmm.
So you go from zero to $16,000. So that's a large incentive. Now, even though women don't actually make choices in that way, but this is like a certain mindset that sees it in this way. So you see that and you think, well, that's an incentive to have kids. If you have a base income, then you're already getting $12,000. And so the additional benefit from having a kid who would receive a child-based income is only $4,000. So it's you're going from 12,000 to 16,000 instead of 0 to 16,000. It's a much smaller incentive. So just looking at it from that way, you can see that it is not disincentive to increase fertility rates. It's actually improving the incentive based on the existing system. And if you look at the evidence, then we just know from all over, there's quite a bit of evidence about this, is that as incomes increase and as society develops, if you're looking at developed nations versus developing nations, if you look at the amount of incomes and people are earning, as your incomes go up and as nations economies develop, fertility rates go down.
Mm-hmm.
Like just the reason people have long had a lot of kids are because to help. So you need
Right.
that extra labor. They can help at the business that you own. They can help on the farm.
The farm,
yeah. And so there were reasons to do that, and there were economic reasons. And so if people have enough money, and you see this, that fertility rates go down.
Right. That's true.
And even from these programs too, from like unconditional cash transfer programs, you see that there's even like a shift. So let's say someone has a kid when they're 15 because they don't have unconditional cash, and that you compare it to someone else and they would have had it at say 15, but then they have a kid instead at like in their mid-20s. So they're still having a kid, but they're waiting until they feel that they're ready for it. Which again, that's different too. That's an important delay. We don't want people having kids. We don't. Teenage pregnancy is not seen as a positive.
Right.
People should be able to choose when they're ready for that.
Oh yes, definitely. And also, I've known people that have put off having kids because they are, like you said, they're very credentialed as far as their profession goes, their PhDs, that are putting off having kids because they can't afford to have a child.
Yeah.
And that's sad. So there's that other side of it as well.
Yeah, that reminds me of something that I just thought was absurd that Paul Ryan said. I think it was like earlier this year or maybe last year, but he said that because of his kids that he was doing his job, of making kids.
Oh wow!
So I just thought that was so funny that like on the one hand that someone can be like very anti, like, oh, you can't have kids and breeding this and this that. And it's like, oh well, on the other hand, it's really important to have kids. We certainly want American families and care and talking about American families. It's like, look, if you are pro-American family, then let's talk about economic security for everybody. And also, this also goes to just looking at abortions too. I mean, if you are pro-life, then you're anti-abortion, and that means you are for people not getting pregnant who would not otherwise get pregnant. And we know that there's an effect here as well, that basic income would be a very anti-abortion policy because you would not be getting pregnant when you would have otherwise. There's just so
Right,
much
right.
of this is like a result of poverty. It's a direct result of
And
poverty.
and that's hard to get people on both sides, like you said, to recognize that a lot of it all goes back to poverty, and that's, it's they just don't want to see it. I think a lot of people don't want to see it. And talking about how to sort of put it in, prepare it or give an imagery or nice pretty picture. Does Star Trek help or hinder basic income? Because one of the articles that I first read on basic income actually used Star Trek as a model. And what's your feelings about Star Trek being used as a model for basic income?
Yeah, I think it's great. I mean, I came about basic income as the like really thinking about the future, like thinking much further down the line than we are right now. It involves really thinking about what happens when we have actually basically eliminated scarcity entirely. And Star Trek does this in a way where they have the replicators, so that there is no scarcity. Anything that you want, you can create, and it's there. So in a world without scarcity, what do people do? Well, people have evolved beyond their current needs to, have a job and to work for a living, to scrape enough money to get by doing whatever, because there's just no scarcity anymore. So
Right.
in a world of full abundance, then that's when you're looking at Maslow's hierarchy. So your bottom levels are covered, in which case what people are choosing to do are the things that mean something to them. Like Captain Picard is not the captain of the Starship Enterprise because he really needs the scratch. Like,
Yeah.
he's captain of the Starship Enterprise because he's an explorer. He feels it's important to reach out to discover the unknown.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
that's what I really love about Star Trek is that it's really that's what it's about. It's that I think that if we're looking at like the development of the human species and what we really could what our potential is for, we're explorers. We want to explore the unknown. We want to learn new things. We want to do the impossible. We want to to achieve things that have never been achieved before. And it's just there's so much that we could be doing as a society in this, like, once we've gotten past this scarcity mindset. So Star Trek just blows that scarcity mindset away. It's gone. And so, they don't have any money either, as the story goes. And so, yeah, just it's really interesting to think about what does that kind of society look like. And I see basic income as really as a means of transition to something more like Star Trek.
Like Star Trek, yeah.
Yeah.
It's the middle way, I guess, between where we are right now and Star Trek.
Yeah. Like we're not going to have basic income for the rest of humanity. This is just like if you look at just the history of everything so far. Everything is always like a temporary thing here and there, and then something else replaces it and you go on to something else. And so, we're just in a temporary stage right now. And, capitalism has done quite a bit and it's worked quite well. But I don't see capitalism working forever either. At some point, there's going to be a post-capitalism. What does that look like? I don't know. But it's not oriented around scarcity. Economics breaks down with scarcity because everything we've built is based on that. It's all about like assuming that there isn't enough and then using it as efficiently as possible. But then if that's gone, well, how do you organize society? What do you do? Mm-hmm. And so before you've gotten to basic income, I was looking at like the idea of a resource-based economy. Through the Zeitgeist movement, Via's projects are to to ways of going about this, or to like, movements or whatever. And so the idea of a resource-based economy is thinking that, okay, so there's no money. Instead, what you do is you treat like the earth as a system, and you say, okay, so we've got this much copper, this much gold, this much nitrogen in the soil, whatever, and what can we accomplish with all of this? And then how do you distribute that abundance in a way, that makes sense? So maybe the economy in Star Trek, or the economy of the future, maybe it's like kind of like a points system. Like maybe the points are based on like the total amount of resources in the world divided by everybody in the world, so that maybe you've got like 1 billion resource credits to use per month, and like you're never going to use that because you don't. There's an abundance. You don't need that. It's just you're doing what you most want to do, and you have the ability to do it. And like the points kind of work is just like, it's like the market system work. It's just a way of figuring out where things go at what time, to make those calculations. And that stuff that's, it's farther down the line. And so I think it's important to think about those things. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it's like I don't want to get caught up in those things and to just think like this UBI is something that we need now. It's something that we needed decades ago, but we definitely need it now, and we're really going to need it in the next 10 years as like our economy totally is transformed by artificial intelligence and things like self-driving cars and all sorts of more affordable robots and stuff. So we really need this, and it's going to function as a transitionary tool to something beyond that we can't really see yet.
Wow, we've talked for almost 2 hours, and I want to thank you for your time. And before we go, though, what do you have coming up as far as future projects, publications, and also list like all your websites or where people can find you, your contact info? Of course, I put some in the description of this video too, but just go ahead and tell us what you're going to be working on in the future.
Yeah, I'm just I do a lot of I'm doing a lot more traveling than I usually do, just giving talks and stuff around the world at different places. But you can go to scottsantens.com. That's my blog. A lot of stuff is there, and reddit.com/r/basic income is the basic income subreddit, and I suggest people going there to just read away, research. There's new links there every day that are about basic income or indirectly about basic income, to see the importance of it. Basicincome.org, I think, is a great way for people to figure out what's going on around the world in the news about basic income. It's a great basic income news site. And, people can support me on Patreon. It's patreon.com/ScottSantens. And, follow me on Twitter at Scott Santens. And I'm always trying to do something else, and I just published a new big thing today that people can check out. They can see that on my Medium blog, and you can find the link on my Twitter. But there's always something else that I'm doing.
Thank you so much for spending, I guess, the afternoon with me.
Yeah, thank you. It's fun.
And also thank you for everyone who's watched and who will watch in the future. Until next time, bye, y'all.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.